1941, Libya. The desert was an open furnace swallowing metal, men and memory. Every breath felt like inhaling fire. A British Crusader tank crawled across the dunes, its shadow dragging behind like a dying animal. Inside, 5 soldiers sat in silence, their faces crusted with dust and sweat. The engine sputtered, coughing its last drops of fuel. "So this gauge is flat," Taylor muttered. Captain James Harland didn't look up. He already knew. "Then this ridge becomes our home," he said quietly. The words hung heavy in the heat. Outside, the wind screamed across the sand like artillery. They had been stranded for 20 hours since the last supply truck vanished. The enemy was closing in, and the desert offered no mercy, only distance. Harland's crew were men of habit, not heroes. Gibbs, the gunner, still polished the tank's optics every morning, even though they hadn't seen clean glass in days. Mace, the loader, counted shells that no longer existed. Cooper, the lookout, stared at the horizon through binoculars cracked by sun. Taylor just drove, or tried to. The Crusaders' treads hissed, dragging like chains. The Germans had pushed them back mile after mile. Now all that remained of their patrol was this one tank, alone, forgotten, surrounded by sand and silence. Harland checked his watch. The hands barely moved. "We hold position until dusk," he said. Gibbs laughed bitterly. "On what, sir? Hope?" Harland didn't smile. "On orders." The air smelled of burning oil. Somewhere far off, an explosion rolled across the dunes, distant thunder over a dead sea. "They're getting closer," Cooper whispered. "Let them," Harland replied. The tank's armor was scarred, its paint blistered, its heart almost gone. But the men inside were not. They were ghosts already, running on discipline, defiance, and the memory of orders that no longer mattered. When the sun began to fall, the desert turned blood red. Shadows stretched across the dunes and silence deepened. Harland climbed out, staring toward the west. In the far distance, black smoke curled upward. He knew what that meant. Another Allied column destroyed. "No one's coming," Mace said softly. Harland ignored him. "Get ready. They'll come from the south." They dug shallow trenches around the Crusader, used empty shell crates for cover. The tank became fortress, tomb, and prayer all in one. Gibbs loaded their last 2 shells. The sun sank lower, and the temperature plummeted. Night here was a different kind of death, cold, sharp, endless. Harland lit a small lantern inside the tank, its flicker casting ghosts across their faces. "This machine's run out of everything," he said. "Except us." The others didn't answer, but in their eyes burned a strange calm. When morning came, the sky was pale silver. Then came the sound, faint at first, then growing. Engines, German panzers moving through the fog of sand. Taylor gripped the steering handle, knowing it was useless. Harland whispered, "Ready." The Crusader fired the first shell. A distant explosion. The second followed, hitting its mark. 2 enemy tanks stopped moving. The third retreated, smoke trailing behind it. But when Gibbs tried to reload, there was nothing left. Silence. The tank wheezed, sputtered, and died. "Out of fuel. Out of ammo," Gibbs said. Harland stared ahead. "Then we wait." And so they did. 5 men in a steel coffin, surrounded by sand, sun, and silence. No one spoke again for hours. The desert had claimed the sound. By the second night, the desert began to play tricks on them. The heat had gone, replaced by a bone-deep chill that made their teeth ache. The stars looked close enough to touch, but the world beneath them was dying slow. Harland's tank was now just a shell of steel, resting on an ocean of silence. The engine was dead. The radio hissed faint static, no signal, no command. Cooper kept turning the knobs anyway, hoping to hear a voice. Any voice, nothing. Just the hum of loneliness. Gibbs had started talking to himself, low muttering about cold beer and Manchester rain. Mace scribbled notes in a small pocketbook, writing what none of them would ever read. "What are you writing?" Harland asked. "Names," Mace said, "so someone remembers." Harland didn't reply. The captain had seen too much war to believe in being remembered. The desert didn't keep stories, it buried them. And yet somewhere inside he refused to let go. They'd been soldiers too long to stop fighting just because the fuel ran dry. At dawn, Cooper spotted movement in the distance. "Panzer patrol," he said, lowering his binoculars. 4, maybe 5 of them. Harland took a deep breath. The Crusader's gun was silent, but its machine gun still worked, barely. "We hold the line," he said. "So with what?" Gibbs snapped. We've got sand, rust, and a prayer. Harlan turned toward him slowly. Then make it count. The first German shell hit 20 meters away, throwing sand like shrapnel. The second one clipped the Crusaders' right track, rocking the tank sideways. Mace screamed as dust filled the cabin. Harlan shouted, "Return fire!" Gibbs manned the gun, spraying the horizon with bullets. The air filled with metallic thunder. 2 German soldiers dropped. The others scattered. Harlan's pulse hammered in his chest. "They'll regroup," Cooper said. "Let them," Harlan replied again, the same calm in his voice, like he'd already made peace with death. When the firing stopped, only wind remained. The crew sat in darkness, breathing hard, hands shaking. Outside, the dunes glowed white under the moonlight. Gibbs looked up through the hatch. 3 days, 72 hours, he murmured. And still no one. Taylor, who had been silent all day, whispered, "Maybe no one's left." Harlan looked at him, then at the tank walls around them, scorched, dented, bleeding oil like a wounded beast. "Then we die as what we are," he said, "soldiers." His voice cracked for the first time. No speeches, no glory, just duty. They didn't sleep that night. Each man sat awake, thinking of somewhere else, home, laughter, rain. When dawn broke, the sand shimmered like glass. On the horizon, a faint shadow appeared. More German armor. Harlan smiled faintly. "They never learn," he whispered. He climbed out of the hatch, rifle in hand, the desert wind clawing at his coat. "Positions!" he shouted. The others followed. 5 men, no fuel, no chance, only defiance. And as the first tank rolled closer, they opened fire again. The sound echoed across the dunes, louder than their fear, louder than death itself. Before the siege of silence, before the sand swallowed their names, the crew of the Crusader had been just another armored patrol under the 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats. They were stationed near Tobruk, a cursed stretch of Libyan desert, where every grain of sand had already tasted blood. Captain James Harland was not born a soldier. He was a teacher once, lecturing on history in Liverpool. But when war came, he traded chalk for command, his classroom for a tank. Duty had a way of rewriting men. His crew had followed him through hell and back, or close enough to it. Gibbs, the gunner, was the loud one, a factory worker from Birmingham who believed laughter scared death away. Mace, the loader, was 19 and had never seen a city bigger than Leeds. Cooper, the lookout, had been a train conductor before the war, eyes sharp, steady hands. Taylor, the driver, was quiet, an orphan who found peace in the steady hum of engines. Together they formed a rhythm, a strange, loyal kind of brotherhood. They'd crossed the desert countless times, outnumbered but never outwilled, until one night the supply convoy vanished, fuel trucks ambushed, radio lines cut. When morning came, the Crusader stood alone. The sun rose, and with it came the truth. They were stranded deep behind enemy lines, 70 miles from any Allied position. "We'll make contact," Harland had said. "We'll find fuel. We'll survive." No one argued. Soldiers don't argue with hope, even when it's dying. The first day, they rationed water and tracked shadows for direction. The second, they saw vultures. On the third, they saw no life at all. The tank had become their world, a metal coffin moving inch by inch, carrying courage and madness in equal measure. Every sound, every click, groan or hiss felt like a heartbeat. They ran on fumes and willpower until even those ran out. By the 4th day, the Crusader coughed its last breath. When the engine fell silent, so did they. "What now, sir?" Gibbs asked. Harland looked out into the endless gold horizon. "Now we wait," he said. It wasn't an order. It was surrender disguised as strategy. That's when the first mirage appeared. A city floating in the heat, white towers shimmering above the dunes. Mace pointed. "Is that real?" Harlan didn't answer. The desert didn't need to kill them. It could just let them believe. Still, they pushed on, dragging hope behind like a broken wheel. When night came, they built a small fire beside the tank, using gun oil to keep it burning. They sat in a circle, silent except for Gibbs, who said, "If we ever get out of here, I'm never complaining about the rain again." Harland half smiled. "If we get out," he said. The next morning, when Cooper saw German tracks cutting through the sand, Harland made his choice. They would stand and fight. No fuel, no backup, no chance, but they'd fight. Because men like him didn't retreat. They endured. At dawn, the desert turned gold and silence returned like a predator. The Crusader sat still, An iron beast turned to stone. Its crew began to move with ritual precision. Taylor checked the treads, even though they would never turn again. Gibbs cleaned the gun sight as if preparing for a parade. Mace polished the shells they could no longer fire. Harland watched them all, knowing duty was the only thing keeping them alive. "We'll make the last of it count," he said. The men nodded. They built defensive mounds around the tank using helmets and shovels, turning their position into a fortress of sand. Cooper climbed the turret, scanning the horizon. Nothing but mirage and wind. Yet he swore he saw dust, movement faint and slow. Harland climbed up beside him, binoculars steady. "German patrol, 3 trucks, 1 panzer," he murmured. No way out, but maybe a way through. They prepared the Crusader like a sleeping lion forced to rise again. Even without fuel, it still held power. The gun could fire. The armor could protect. Hope flickered. Gibbs loaded the first round, whispering something under his breath. "For Liverpool," Harland said quietly, and the rest echoed their own cities, names of places that felt like dreams now. When the German column came into range, Harland gave the order. The Crusader roared once more. The first shell ripped through the Panzer's side, sending flames skyward. The second hit a truck, scattering soldiers into the dunes. But soon the counterfire began. Mortars landed nearby, shaking the desert. The tank shuddered but stood. For 3 hours it became a ghost of its former self, half alive, half memory. When ammunition ran low, Harland ordered the men to conserve fire. The Germans regrouped, unsure how an abandoned tank was fighting back. By nightfall they withdrew, leaving smoke and confusion behind. The crew had survived, barely. But survival was just another battle. Their rations were gone, lips cracked, eyes hollow. Mace fainted that night, and Gibbs shared the last sip of water with him. Harland didn't sleep. He kept writing coordinates in a notebook, drawing imaginary rescue routes that all led to nowhere. "You still think someone's coming?" Taylor asked. Harland looked at the stars. "Someone always comes," he replied, but his voice broke. On the 7th night, a sandstorm hit. It buried their tracks, their tools, and almost their faith. Inside the tank, the world turned into thunder. They held onto each other, listening to metal scream. When it ended, only silence remained. In the morning, the desert looked new again, as if nothing had ever lived there. Then out of the dust came the sound of engines, real ones, British recon patrols, drawn by the smoke from the earlier fight. When they reached the Crusader, they found 5 men still alive inside, pale, trembling and smiling through cracked lips. 72 hours without fuel, 3 days against death itself. When they were rescued, Gibbs whispered, "Told you laughter scares death." Harland just stared at the horizon as if the desert still owed him an answer. The report of their ordeal spread through the 7th Armored Division like wildfire. Men who'd faced tanks and storms still shook their heads in disbelief. 72 hours, no fuel," someone muttered. "That's not survival, that's defiance." Captain Harland and his crew became living symbols of the desert's madness and courage intertwined. But glory is a short guest in war. Days after their rescue, Harland's crew was ordered to return to Tobruk's front lines. The British push toward El Agheila was faltering, and every able tank, working or not, was needed. Their Crusader, patched up and refueled, rolled again into the abyss. Yet something in the men had changed. The desert had stripped away fear, but also mercy. They were harder now, quieter, their laughter brittle as dried leaves. Gibbs still cracked jokes, but no one laughed the same way. Mace, once the youngest and brightest, spoke less and less, as if every word cost him water. Taylor drove like a man chasing ghosts. Harland carried a map that no longer showed just roads. It showed memories, places where men had lived, fought, and vanished. The new offensive began under blazing sun. British tanks advanced across open sand, hunted by German dive bombers that screamed like banshees. Harland's unit pushed forward, following radio orders that kept changing every hour. Confusion spread faster than courage. On the 2nd day, a Stuka bomb hit nearby, throwing their Crusader into the air. When the dust cleared, Cooper's arm was bleeding and the right tread was torn. "We can fix it," Taylor said through gritted teeth, but the damage ran deeper than metal. The Crusader was slowing again, history repeating itself. Harland ordered the crew to dig in. "We hold," he said, voice cold as iron. As night fell, German armor appeared on the ridge, 3 panzers closing fast. Harland radioed for support, but static answered back. "We're on our own again," Gibbs muttered. The crew loaded shells, hearts pounding with a grim familiarity. The first shot from the Crusader struck true, igniting a Panzer's fuel line. Fire painted the dunes red. The second enemy tank returned fire, missing by inches. Shockwaves threw sand into their faces, stinging eyes and lungs. "We're not running this time," Harland growled. "We never did," Taylor replied. Then came the third tank, larger, faster, relentless. The Crusader fired missed. Before they could reload, a shell tore through the rear plating, setting the interior ablaze. Mace screamed, smoke filling the cabin. Harland grabbed the extinguisher, choking as fire ate oxygen. "Out, everyone out!" he yelled. They tumbled into the sand, rolling away as the tank exploded, a dying roar echoing into the night. Flames climbed to the stars. The Crusader was gone. Their armor, their home, their symbol, reduced to ash. Harland stood watching it burn, face glowing orange in the darkness. "That's twice we've been abandoned," Gibbs said quietly. Harland didn't reply. In war, sometimes loss becomes your only companion. The night after the Crusaders' destruction was long and cruel. The desert wind howled like the ghosts of engines long dead. Harland's crew huddled behind a dune, watching their burning tank fade into embers. The air smelled of oil and iron. "So what now?" Gibbs finally asked, voice raw. Harland looked at the horizon where enemy flares bloomed like dying stars. "We keep fighting," he said. "We started as tankmen. We'll end as soldiers." They gathered what they could, rifles, a few grenades, canteens half full of sand instead of water. Cooper's arm was bound with a torn sleeve, blood already seeping through. Mace shivered despite the heat. They began their trek toward the British line, 30 miles west, through shifting dunes and enemy patrols. Every step felt heavier than steel. When dawn broke, they saw tracks, German supply vehicles heading north. "If we can reach them, maybe we can steal one," Taylor said. Harland nodded. "Then we hunt." By mid-morning, they spotted the convoy, a small group of trucks guarded by 6 soldiers. No tanks, no heavy guns, just men and supplies. Perfect odds for desperate souls. Harland outlined the plan in the sand. Flank from the left, silent approach, hit fast. Gibbs grinned despite the exhaustion. "You know, sir, for someone who hates gambling, you're pretty good at it." "We've got nothing left to lose," Harland replied. The attack came swift and brutal. The British rifles barked once, twice, echoes swallowed by wind. Within minutes, the Germans fell, surprised by ghosts they thought the desert had already claimed. They captured a truck loaded with water, ammo, and precious fuel. Mace laughed for the first time in days. "We did it!" he shouted. But Harland's face stayed grim. "We stole hours, not salvation," he said. Still, those hours mattered. They refueled a damaged German half-track and drove through the dunes, aiming for Tobruk. The sun chased them, merciless. By night, Cooper's wound reopened, and Gibbs drove while singing to keep him conscious. Harland kept watch, binoculars scanning for movement. He saw none. The silence grew heavier with each mile. On the third day, engines sputtered. Fuel was running dry again. "Not again," Taylor whispered. "We can't do 72 more." Harland didn't answer. He stared ahead, where a ridge rose from the sand like a promise. "There," he said. "One more hill." They climbed, the half-track gasping, metal screaming. At the top, they saw it. The British line, a faint shimmer of tents and trucks in the far distance. Salvation, fragile and unreal. But behind them, dust clouds, German pursuit. "Positions!" Harland barked. They turned the half-track into a last stand. The desert echoed with gunfire once more. Mace fell, struck in the shoulder. Gibbs returned fire until his rifle clicked empty. Cooper aimed one-handed, lips trembling prayers. Harland threw his last grenade, flames erupting like judgment. The Germans retreated, unwilling to chase ghosts into madness. When silence returned, the crew was still alive, but barely. The sun began to rise again, merciless, endless. Harland stood over the smoking half-track, whispering to no one. The desert takes everything, except men who refuse to stop. The ridge became their altar, and survival their prayer. Harland's crew stood there, 5 men stripped of rank, medals, and illusion, just willpower left. The British outpost was still miles away, a shimmering ghost in the haze, and their bodies were barely obeying orders. "We move at first light," Harland said, voice cracked but steady. Taylor nodded, eyes hollow but determined. Gibbs had a bullet graze on his neck. Blood dried into a black streak. Mace was pale, wounded but conscious, whispering the same line every few minutes. "We'll make it. We'll make it." Cooper, his bandaged arm useless, carried ammo with the other. They didn't march, they drifted forward like shadows. By noon the desert turned into a furnace. Sand burned through their boots. The heat clawed their skin. But what hurt most wasn't thirst, it was the silence. No engines, no radio chatter, no roar of Crusader steel. The tank had been their voice, their identity. Without it they felt ghost-like. Then, faint at first, came a low rumble. Engines. British, maybe? Harlan signaled everyone down. Through binoculars he saw a convoy approaching, but it wasn't theirs. German half-tracks, a dozen strong, cutting through the dunes toward Tobruk. If they reached the line first, Allied positions would be exposed. "We can't let them pass," Harlan said. Gibbs stared, disbelief in his eyes. "Sir, we've got 5 bullets and a miracle between us." "Then we use both," Harlan replied. They crawled into position along the ridge, the sun beating down like punishment. Harlan studied the slope, the distance, the timing. He had once lectured about great battles, Thermopylae, Rorke's Drift, hopeless stands that defined courage. Now he was living one. "Wait until they're close," he ordered. The rumble grew louder. Trucks and soldiers shimmered in the heat. At 50 meters, Harlan gave the signal. Gunfire erupted, short, sharp, desperate. 2 trucks veered, one exploded in flames. The Germans scattered, unsure of where the attack came from. Gibbs fired until his rifle clicked empty. Taylor hurled a grenade downhill, shattering the lead vehicle. Smoke rolled upward, thick and choking. "Reload!" Harlan shouted, but there was nothing left to reload. The fight was sheer will now. Rocks, fists, bayonets, survival instinct. The Germans fired back, bullets slicing sand around them. Cooper went down, hit in the leg. Harlan dragged him behind cover, returning fire with a captured pistol. "They'll flank us," Mace yelled. Harlan knew he was right. Their line would break in minutes. Then he saw it. One of the burning German trucks still carried fuel drums. He crawled toward it, every breath a battle. Gibbs saw what he was doing. "You're insane, sir." "That's why it might work," Harlan hissed. He ripped open a drum, soaked rags in fuel, and lit them with a flare. The desert lit up like the sun itself. A wall of fire cut across the slope, blinding both sides. The Germans fell back, retreating into confusion and smoke. Harlan collapsed beside the burning wreck, gasping, the heat searing his face. "We hold," he whispered. For once the desert seemed to listen. The wall of fire raged through the dunes, turning the sand into molten glass. The Germans had fallen back, but Harlan knew they'd return. Fire only bought time, and time was bleeding out as fast as the men beside him. Gibbs coughed violently, black smoke in his lungs. "We're out of miracles, sir," he said, smiling through cracked lips. "Then we make one," Harlan answered, voice barely more than a whisper. He scanned the wreckage, the broken trucks, the shattered crates. Among them a single working radio, half-crushed but flickering with static. Hope in fragments. He pulled it free, twisting the wires with shaking hands. "Taylor, see if you can get power from that engine block." Taylor crawled to the wreck, sparks flying as he rigged a crude connection. The radio hissed, sputtered, then came alive with a faint British signal. "This is Harlan. Crusader crew. Coordinates." Static drowned his words, but he kept speaking, praying anyone heard. Mace covered the ridge, rifle trembling in his wounded hands. Cooper, bleeding heavily, tried to stay awake. "We'll make it," he muttered again, voice fading. "We always do." But Harlan saw the truth in their eyes. They were past saving themselves. Only the message mattered now. British command needed to know where the Germans were heading, or Tobruk would fall by dawn. He grabbed Gibbs's shoulder. "You hold this line," he said. "Even if it's just us left." Gibbs grinned weakly. "Aye, sir. Let's make 'em think there's an army up here." The Germans regrouped, moving through the smoke, cautious now. Harlan set the radio to repeat their coordinates, tying down the transmit key. "They'll find it," Taylor said. "They have to." Harlan looked toward the flames. "They will." The next assault came hard. Machine guns tore the sand apart. Mace went down, hit in the chest. Gibbs kept firing until he couldn't. Taylor threw his last grenade, taking 2 enemies with him. Harlan fought until the pistol clicked empty. Then silence, only wind, smoke, and the hum of the dying radio. Hours later, British armour rolled over the ridge drawn by the broadcast. They found what was left, a charred ridge, a burning horizon, and 5 men who never retreated. The Germans had been pushed back, their advance halted by a message sent through smoke and sacrifice. The Crusader crew was gone, but their stand saved hundreds at Tobruk. When their story reached command, a single line was written in the report. Held position 72 hours without fuel. No medals, no speeches, just that line. But soldiers whispered it like a legend. Somewhere in that endless desert, a wreck still stands half buried in sand, its armor rusted, its turret facing the sunrise. Locals call it the Lion of Libya, and when the wind blows right, they say it sounds like an engine starting again. When the British patrol finally returned with the bodies, the desert greeted them with silence. The sun had risen high, its light cruel and unforgiving, glinting off the twisted remains of metal that had once been the Crusaders' kin. Harlan's men were found still in position, weapons near their hands as if waiting for one last order. The rescue team didn't speak. Even hardened veterans of Tobruk stood wordless before the sight. "They never moved," one sergeant whispered. "They died standing guard." The coordinates transmitted by Harlan's crew had led British armour straight to the German flank. That single broadcast changed the tide near Tobruk, allowing reinforcements to arrive just hours before an ambush would have destroyed the supply columns. The 5 men, forgotten by command until their message broke through, had saved a brigade. Their names were filed, their bravery marked in ink that would fade long before their story did. Captain James Harland, Corporal Gibbs, Private Taylor, Lance Corporal Mace, Scout Cooper, 5 names in a sea of thousands, yet their silence echoed the loudest. Their remains were buried near the ridge where they fell. The grave markers were simple, wooden crosses carved from fuel crates. On Harlan's, someone had etched a single line from his field notes: "We hold." The desert wind carried it for miles. Word spread among the 7th Armored Division, faster than official reports. Soldiers began calling their last stand the battle without fuel. Some said it was madness. Others called it destiny. Either way, it became a legend, proof that courage didn't need machines, that resolve could outlast engines. The next time tanks rolled toward the front, crews painted small lions on their hulls in honor of the Crusader crew. It wasn't an order. It was instinct. A promise that they'd never surrender to silence again. In London, months later, a historian compiling reports came across their file. The details were minimal, but the phrasing caught his attention. He wrote an article for The Times titled, "The Tank That Fought Without Fuel." It spread like wildfire across Britain, inspiring letters, posters, and songs. Mothers wrote to the army asking if the story was true. The War Office never confirmed it. Officially, there was no such engagement. But soldiers knew better. The desert doesn't keep lies, it only keeps secrets. Weeks later, a British recovery unit returned to the ridge. Their mission was simple: salvage what was left of the Crusader wrecks and recover usable parts. But when they reached the site, the crew paused. The ridge was silent again, untouched since the day Harlan's men made their stand. Half buried in sand, the remnants of the German truck still lay scorched black, metal twisted like bones. In the center, one object stood against time, the Crusader's gun barrel aimed eternally toward the sunrise. An engineer climbed the slope and placed his hand on the steel. It was still warm, though the sun had barely risen. "Feels alive," he murmured. They decided to leave it as it was. No one had the heart to move the dead lion from its throne. Word of the sight spread among troops as they passed through Libya. Men left small offerings, spent shells, badges, even ration tins marked with their unit numbers. Each one carried the same message: for the crew that never quit. In Cairo, General Montgomery heard of the ridge and requested a report. When he read it, he said only, "They did what was impossible." The War Office never released the full account, but whispers traveled faster than censors. By 1943, soldiers across North Africa knew the legend by heart. They said the 5 men had fought 72 hours without fuel, that their tank fired when engines were dead, that the desert itself carried their gunfire to the heavens. It became more than a tale. It became morale, a myth soldiers clung to in the endless sand. And myths in war can be stronger than armies. Years later, after victory in Europe, a young journalist visited the ridge. He found the rusted Crusader still there, half consumed by dunes. The gun was fused in place, pointing east. He knelt beside it, brushing away sand to reveal faint letters scratched into the hull. We held. Nothing else. No plaque, no monument, just those two words carved by dying hands. When his article was published, it reignited the legend. Veterans wrote back saying they'd passed through that ridge, that they'd felt something in the air, an echo of courage that refused to die. Today, if you stand in that same spot at dawn, the wind hums through the barrel like a whispering voice. Locals call it the Song of the Crusader. Some claim it's the sound of ghosts guarding the desert still. Historians debate what really happened there. Some say exaggeration turned soldiers into saints. Others believe the tale exactly as told. But maybe the truth lies somewhere between, the line where duty meets destiny. The Crusader crew's story isn't about victory or defeat. It's about endurance, the kind that turns ordinary men into something eternal. And though their tank may rust and their names fade, the desert remembers, always. The desert keeps its secrets, but some it guards with pride. Long after the war ended, nomads passing through the Libyan sands spoke of strange lights flickering atop a distant ridge, soft glows that moved like lanterns in the dark. Soldiers dismissed it as heat shimmer, but those who knew the story whispered differently. They said it was the Crusader crew, keeping watch even in death. In 1952, a team of British engineers returned to that same ridge to chart abandoned battle sites. What they found froze them in place. The Crusaders' main cannon, though rusted and half swallowed by sand, still bore the faint scent of burned cordite, the chemical trace of a gun recently fired. Impossible, they said, yet instruments confirmed it. No human could explain it, but history didn't need to. The story had already become sacred, carried in mess tents and training camps across generations. It was taught to new recruits not as fact but as faith, that when everything fails, grit can still burn brighter than gasoline. Veterans who fought alongside Harlan's regiment described him as calm under fire, a man who made silence feel safe. One remembered how Harlan once said, "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's running out of options and moving anyway." Those words outlived him, printed on the walls of British tank schools decades later. By the 1970s, the tale of the 72-hour stand was studied in officer academies. Analysts called it a psychological case study in endurance, but to soldiers it was simpler. 5 men who refused to surrender. Nothing more, nothing less. The Libyan desert has changed since then. Oil roads cut through the sands, and tourists now visit the old battlefields, posing beside rusted relics. Yet when they reach that ridge, cameras fall silent. There's a weight in the air, a quiet too complete to be natural. Some say it's the heat, others say it's history watching. One tourist, a descendant of Harlan's gunner, once placed a flower on the turret and said quietly, "Grandfather, you never made it home." But the desert became your home instead. That moment was caught on tape, broadcast worldwide, and thousands wept for men they never met. Because deep down, every soldier, every dreamer, every survivor of struggle knows what it means to stand when there's nothing left to stand for. That's why the legend endures. It isn't bound by time or soil. It's bound by spirit. The Crusader didn't just fight. It became a symbol of the last stand in all of us. And when the wind howls across that ancient sand sea, carrying grains like whispered prayers, it doesn't speak of loss. It sings of loyalty. In 1991, during the Gulf War, a young British tank commander named Ellis Harland, grandnephew of Captain Harland, was stationed in Saudi Arabia. On his first night before deployment, he dreamt of a burning horizon and 5 silhouettes standing beside a tank. One turned to him and said, "Keep your barrel east." When he woke, his compass was pointing exactly east, though his vehicle had been parked north. He told no one, but after the war he visited Libya. Guided by coordinates from his grandfather's old maps, he found the ridge. The Crusader was gone, swallowed completely by sand. But when he stood in silence, the wind rose like a sigh, and for a moment he thought he heard footsteps circling behind him. He saluted the empty dunes and left a single brass shell engraved with 2 words, "Still holding." That shell remains there today, embedded in the ridge, an echo meeting an echo. Modern archaeologists have since confirmed traces of intense combat at that location. Melted steel, scorched soil, and fragments of British uniforms fused to tank armor. Yet, curiously, no records list any German recovery unit near that site. The mystery deepened Even satellite imaging shows faint heat anomalies at night, like something beneath the sand still breathes. Scientists dismiss it as residual radiation from wartime shells. Locals don't agree. To them, the ridge is sacred ground. Shepherds avoid it after dark, saying the wind speaks English there. The Libyan government eventually marked it as a historical zone, Hill 72, after the 72 hours of resistance that carved eternity into stone. Military historians still argue whether it was heroism, madness, or both. But those who have fought know the truth. Sometimes survival isn't about living, it's about refusing to vanish quietly. And that's what Harlan's men did. They didn't survive the battle, but they defeated time. Every grain of sand that brushes against that buried crusader carries part of their defiance. Jed said that when storms rage hardest, the dunes shift just enough to reveal the outline of a tank, standing guard once more before disappearing again at dawn. Maybe it's myth, maybe it's memory refusing to die. Either way, one thing is certain. The ridge still watches, the desert still remembers, and courage once born never runs out of fuel.